In this content, we'll be talking about the last method, experimental designs, the only design that can show a causal relationship that is so desired in Western. So experimental designs, which are also sometimes called randomized controlled trials, are the only way to determine causality, and this is the magic word in statistics. We always after causality. And in order to be an experiment or an RCT, it has to have two things. And the first is the manipulation or treatment. We have to do something to participants. And the second is random assignment of subjects to a condition. So they have to be randomly assigned. And here's a review of these terms that we went over before. A variable is any factor that varies or differs among subjects. An independent variable is what is controlled by the researcher, and a dependent variable is what is being measured. So I'm not going to worry about this terminology, but we'll go through this example, and in class we'll be watching some little videos and things like this, but hopefully you'll review this at least ahead of time. So here we have our patients. We randomly assign some to a treatment group and some to a control group, and then we follow up and compare their results. Simple design. Some more designs. Does giving cause happiness? So the manipulation, subjects are given $5 and randomly assigned to one of three conditions. So this is a real experiment, and it was with students, and students were invited in the morning to come to the lab, and they were given $5. And they were just told one of three things, and then they needed to come back at the end of the day. And so in the first condition, if they were randomly assigned this, the researcher told them, buy a gift for someone else and stop back at the end of the day. In the second condition, they were told, buy something for yourself and stop back at the end of the day. In the third condition, they were just given the $5 and told, stop back at the end of the day. And so in this case, the independent variable is the spending instruction, buying for someone else, buying for yourself, or control. And the dependent variable, what was going to be measured at the end of the day, was happiness. So it was a true experiment because there was a manipulation, which is the instructions about the $5, and there was random assignment to one of the conditions. So it is an experiment. And in fact, the results were that givers, the ones who gave a gift to someone else, reported higher levels of happiness upon return than those who bought for themselves or the control group. And we can't address this here because it's just me talking. So here we'll discuss the difference with some examples between field and lab experiments exploring the bystander effect, which we've been focusing on in our class. So first off, an example of the field experiment is the Good Samaritan study. You've already seen a video of this, but I also have it linked for you within the slides. So this was an experiment. That's the first thing we should check. And it was an experiment because participants were randomly assigned to a manipulation before passing the injured man on the sidewalk. And as we know, random assignment and a manipulation are the two conditions for an experiment. And as you know, they were exposed to the condition where they were told they were very late for a talk they needed to give, or that they were just on time, but they should, not waste any time, or that they had enough time as long as they walked on over. And then, of course, as you know, they measured whether they helped the injured stranger on the side of the road. But we would also say that this is a field experiment because it took place in buildings and a walkway at the school in which students were already enrolled. So the manipulation or the instruction and the injured person were added to the natural setting. That's why it's a field experiment. And another example, that is to say, another study that you've already seen was the smoky room study. And this would be a lab experiment. So let's take a look at it. First off, was it an experiment? And it was because people were randomly assigned to a manipulation before the room was filled with smoke. And the manipulation was either they were alone in the room or they were in the room with others. And of course, they measured whether they reacted to the smoke. And then we say this was a lab experiment, not a field experiment, because the study took place in an office that was controlled by the researcher. Participants had not been in this space before and entered it for the first time to fill out some paperwork. So because it took place in this unfamiliar setting, the manipulation, the presence of others, and the smoky room were added to what we'd call the lab setting. And so it was an experiment, and it was in the lab, so it was a lab experiment. A couple more examples. These are video links that you'll need to click on. They're really definitely experiments you should watch. And this one example here is an example of whether children were more aggressive if they observed aggressive behavior than if they observed gentle behavior. And secondly, and this was a lab experiment because the whole situation was set up and it took place in a controlled setting. And a class divided is another excellent experiment that you should watch. It's a field experiment because this took place with a teacher and her children in an actual classroom, so in a natural setting. And so this is another study you should watch. So let's look at some practice items: lab experiment, field experiment, or not an experiment. So first example, participants in a research study were those who happened to be walking down the street and agreed to sign a form supporting a popular cause. If they agreed, each was asked to hold the researcher's cup for a moment while he retrieved a pen from his briefcase. Participants in the study were randomly assigned to A, hold a cup that was cold with an iced beverage, or B, hold a cup that was warm with a hot beverage. And then they measured how willing they were to assist the researcher. And so in this case, we can see that this is taking place with people who are walking down the street. And so this is a field experiment that took place in a natural setting. The second example, participants in a research study were invited to an office to play a computer game of cyberball. During the game, each participant was randomly assigned to A, a rejection condition in which the ball was thrown to them once and then never again, or B, an acceptance condition in which the ball was thrown to them as often as it was thrown to others. After playing the game, they exited the room to see a person accidentally drop a stack of papers on the floor. Researchers observed how long they stayed to help the person pick up the papers. And in this case, we would have to conclude that it's a lab experiment because it took place in this setting that was completely controlled by the researcher. And even the person that they saw outside the office had dropped the papers. Even that person was a Confederate. So there was nothing about the setting that was natural. And number 3, participants in a research study provided information about whether they had used vaping devices in the past 24 hours. Measures of anxiety were compared for those who A, had used vape within the past 24 hours, or B, had not used vape within the last 24 hours. And this might look like an experiment because we see that we have these two groups that we're comparing, but it's not an experiment because nothing was done to these participants, for one thing, and for another thing, nobody was randomly assigned. They weren't randomly assigned to smoke vape or use vape, or not use vape. This is just the way they were, what their experience had been. So we would say that this is not an experiment. So there are pros and cons of both. So lab experiments, there's a lot of control of extraneous factors, and by extraneous factors, we just mean other things that might impact people differently who are participating. And there are few or no confounding factors. And by that we mean factors that are likely to influence the behavior of the participants instead of what the researcher is interested in. And so it's really easy to determine cause and effect. So the factor that the researcher thought would cause a behavior, well, it's pretty clean. There's not much to get in the way. And so we say it has high internal validity. But on the other hand, if we have such a study that took place with all this control by the researcher, we might have trouble generalizing to a natural setting. In the real world, people might behave differently. and a good part of research is to generalize to the natural setting. And so we call this low external validity, meaning that it's not valid outside of the study setting. And we're going to look at both of these terms a little bit more. Field experiments, on the other hand, well, they're really generalizable. I mean, they took place in the natural setting, and so we really do see how this would be likely to occur in that same natural setting again. So we say it says high external validity. But the researcher can't control very much about the situation or anything that might affect human responses. And so because these participants are just living their lives walking down the street, for example, then the researcher can't control everything. And so confounds and extraneous variables are possible. It might be more difficult to establish a clear cause and effect. So we say it has lower internal validity. So validity is a new term for you, and it's a really important one when you talk about research. It means how legitimate is the experiment, or how well does it measure and test what it claims to measure and test. So if we're interested in the relationship between, let's say, being late or feeling that you're late and how helpful you are, well, then we want to make sure that the only thing affecting your helpfulness is your lateness, because that's what the researcher is interested in. And so if we have a really tight study where the only thing that is impacting the variable that you're measuring is the factor that you've manipulated, well, then we say the inside of the experiment or the internal aspects of the experiment are valid. They're doing what they're supposed to do. We can see that the predictor variable, which later on you'll learn is called the independent variable, indeed produced the change in what was being measured. So that's called internal validity. Inside the experiment, it's good. External validity means, well, can we take these findings and draw conclusions about the general population? And so if we have a study that takes place in a lab, someone might, even if it's a really good clean study, someone might criticize it and say, yes, but in the real world, we don't know how people would act. And so that's a critique of a study that takes place in a lab. And so if it takes place in a natural setting, then we can apply it more generally, and that criticism can't be launched. But we might have other criticisms. We might be able to say, yes, but how do you know it was your manipulation that affected the outcome when there were so many things going on in the outside world? And so it has high external validity, but the internal validity might be low. And so this is a balancing act that researchers always have to do, is to find out how to get a study with good internal validity that can also be generalized to a population. So let's look at some examples on the next slide. So here is our first example. Regina definitely wants to conduct her study of dog owner interactions in a dog park where many owners and their dogs engage for long periods of time. She believes she will get a better sense of authentic behaviors if she observes in that setting. What is her top priority? And in this case, we would want to say that her top priority is external validity. She's looking to take this study in a natural setting. This is a field study, and so she's really concerned that it would generalize, that it's representing the real world. Number 2, Serrana was interested in whether dogs felt attached to their owners or just wanted to be with their owners because those owners provided food. She identified a large number of individuals who had to leave their dogs alone during the day to go to work and invited them to bring their dogs to a special place where they would be left alone in a comfortable space with a bowl of water for the day, much like their experience in their own homes. A bowl of food was placed just outside the door housing the dog, such that both food and owner would appear at the same time after the owner's workday. She then observed whether the dogs went to the owners first or the food first, and measured how long they spent with their first choice, which was the food or the owner, whichever they chose, before moving to the other. Which may be slightly weaker in this study, internal or external validity? And in this case, we have a lab experiment because this is not taking place in the natural setting. Even though this is something that would happen in the dog's life, it would take place in the home. So we'd say this is taking place in a lab setting. And so we probably have higher internal validity. It's a cleaner experiment, but we might not be able to generalize. Someone criticizing this study might say, yes, but how do we know that whatever the dogs did in response to the stimulus, maybe they did it just because they were anxious being in a strange place or something like that. So maybe we can't generalize to the typical experience of dogs left alone during the day. Finally, Dr. Smith is very careful to ensure that every participant in her study has exactly the same experience. She carefully controls the setting, time, temperature, noise, and every other variable she can think of, so that, if her hypothesis is supported, no factors except the predictor could explain the outcome. What appears to be strong in her study, internal or external validity? And in this case, all the controls that she has, this means that the inside of her study is pretty tight. It has good control. And so she has stronger internal validity, but her external validity might be weaker. Now we have a third type of experiment that I'll ask you to give some thought to. It doesn't exactly include treatment control and random assignment, but it still explores meaningful data. And let's see about how we think it qualifies as an experiment. So let's imagine these might be pre-post studies. So we take people who before they're married and after they're married, and we compare their happiness. So these are natural events occurring in their lives. Okay, so we have two conditions that occur naturally in people's lives. Another example, maybe we'll gather students' concentration data before and after recess. And excuse me, I didn't read this properly. Not before and after recess, but this is in response to a tendency that some schools have to remove recesses from children in order to get more time for academics. And so this isn't before and after recess, but before and after these recesses are taken away from children. So a school is already going to implement this policy, and so now someone wants to test it to find out, does this impact children's concentration? Now, the problem with this pre-post design is that there might be other explanations or confounds that might relate to it. So for example, the study that's examining happiness before and after marriage, well, there are other things happening in these people's lives before and after marriage, and maybe it's those other things that are causing the happiness and not the marriage itself. Likewise, if this researcher gathers concentration data before and after recesses are removed, well, let's imagine that they take the recesses away in October of the school year, and the researcher gathers data from September and then October and November. Well, children change over that course of time. They mature, for one thing. Maybe school's novelty effect wears off and the children are getting bored. Maybe the holidays are approaching. And so then a criticism of that study might be, maybe the concentration data reflects these things that happened over time naturally and not the recesses themselves. But another way that we might think about it is to look at phenomena that occur in some areas and not others. So for example, there is TV that was introduced in certain parts of the country, and it wasn't introduced yet in other parts of the country. So if we wanted to find out what the impact of TV was on homes, then we might compare some variable of interest between those households who had gotten the TV and those who hadn't yet gotten the TV. So that's happening naturally. Or maybe we want to look at natural phenomena, like people who are experiencing these wildfires or hurricane regions. And so maybe we want to know if something about the stress level or the reaction to trauma is different for people who have lived in these areas with wildfires and those who have not. So when we debate whether these are experiments, we would say, well, they are and they aren't, because the researcher didn't manipulate anything in any of these cases, but the world did. So in the first example, the life itself intervened with this marriage. In the second example, the policy came into effect about changing recess. In the third example, TV, just for practical reasons, could not be introduced everywhere at once, so we had some people with and some without. And finally, the wildfires or hurricane example, well, these people did have different experiences because of natural phenomena. So even though the researcher didn't manipulate anything, life's outcomes seem to have chosen people at random to experience one or another thing. And so we have the random assignment, and we have sort of a treatment control going on. It's just that the researcher didn't do it, and that's why these are called natural experiments. Now, this video that you'll be able to see, it will be linked here for you on the video, is looking at, this is actually with Native American people, and it's the impact of a casino on certain things. So we'll take a look at that video. You'll watch it on your own time, I imagine, is how it'll play out. And then finally, we have quasi-experiments, all of the characteristics of true experiments except one. Usually, they're not randomly assigning. So for example, sometimes that might be necessary. We're interested in the difference between boys and girls, and we can't randomly assign some people to be boys and some to be girls. And so that happens naturally. And so we end up with experiments are needed to demonstrate causal relationships. Experiments have two needed components, manipulation or treatment of some sort, and random assignment to conditions. Confounds, we looked at that word a little bit, are alternate explanations that could have explained the effect instead of the measured condition. Studies with good internal validity test what they are intending to test with few confounds. So good manipulations, good control conditions, good statistics, enough people, good measures, all of those things are internal validity. And we'll be looking at these details later in the term. For right now, we're just understanding what internal validity is, meaning that the inside, the designs of the test, of the experiment, were valid. And then studies with good external validity can be generalized to a population because the sample was randomly selected from the population, and maybe it took place in a natural setting or was a field experiment. And so all of those would contribute to external validity.